care to open with me to Genesis chapter 10. We'll be coming to some of those verses shortly. For those people, particularly for those folk whose English is not their first language and who may have the notes which I sent out earlier in the week, let me just say that everything we'll be saying today will be in the notes, but it might just not come out in exactly the same order. So if you have your notes there, then you may use them, but you might not just immediately always pick up exactly where we are from the notes. Last week we focused on a couple of passages that were central to our understanding of the nations and their relationship to God and God's relationship to them. We looked at this passage from Genesis chapter 10, which is sometimes called the Table of Nations, the list of nations. And we made some comments about the way in which that was structured and the purpose of it, particularly in its location in that part of Genesis. We also looked at some elements of the account of the building of the tower. And some of the material that we touched on last week we'll need to keep coming back to week after week as we build out this theme on God and the nations, and particularly in relationship to that this morning, the power which is behind the thrones of the nations. The nations are not freestanding entities, any more than a human being is a freestanding entity. There is no such thing in the Scriptures just merely as a human being. There is always a human being in relationship to God, or a human being in relationship to the powers and principalities which operate in the unseen realm. There is no such thing merely as a human being, so there's no way that we can consider the nations merely as nations. Otherwise we'd be simply operating on the horizontal level, where we'd be thinking that the rise and fall of nations, the movement of nations, victories and defeats of nations, all has to do primarily with politics or economics or social theory. Those things may have a place, but they aren't anything like the depth. They don't take us to anything like the depth that the Scriptures do in their understanding of what's happening in and through and among the nations. But at various points during this series, and today as an example, we're going to need to comment on the nature of power and to observe the fact that the nations are essentially power hungry. They are looking for power, wanting to exercise power, and wanting to use that power to gain mastery over others. But the nations themselves, in their power hunger, would not recognize that there is another source of power behind them. The kings of the earth take their stand, and the princes take counsel against the Lord and against his anointed, as Grant read to us from Psalm 2. But the kings of the earth and the princes of the world would not recognize that there is another power behind them, that they themselves are being ruled over. And what we want to look at this week is what is the nature of the power behind the thrones, and how is it that Jesus Christ comes to undo that power, and what he must do in order to do that. And what we're going to be saying today is, firstly, that the power behind the thrones is in essence the same power that is behind all human sin and iniquity. And that's why we've taken the reading from Genesis chapter 3 with the account of the temptation that came to their first parents. And in that temptation was the implied criticism of God that he was withholding his best from humanity, that there was a secret treasure which he held, which he did not want human beings to share in. That secret treasure was the knowledge of good and evil. And the serpent's temptation to our first parents was, you can be as God, you yourselves can know good and evil. So the power behind human iniquity is the serpent. There can be no doubt about that. the ancient serpent of old called the devil or the dragon, Lucifer, the angel of darkness, angel of light, who is in fact the angel of darkness. But the way in which he insinuates himself into the mind of our first parents was in this matter of good and evil. How we may evaluate what's good and how we may evaluate what's evil, all in independence from God. So that it's not simply we would be content to bear the image and likeness of God, which we already bore in creation. The temptation is that we ourselves would be gods to ourselves, and being gods to ourselves meant that we would be able to define for ourselves what is good and what is evil. And in defining for ourselves what is good and what is evil, we find that we are in fact under the power of the serpent. Now, humanity does not recognize that. The nations do not recognize that. In our fallenness, we think it's our God-given right to determine for ourselves what is good and what is evil. And the nations believe they have their right to determine for themselves what is good and evil. And the newspapers and electronic media this week have been very full of a question about, is it good that a particular country have long-range missiles and launch them? Or is it evil? And from the rulers of that country, they would say this is very good. And from the rulers of countries within the arc of those long-range missiles, they would say it's very evil. And so the nations operate on their basis of what is good and evil, and that basis leads them to engage in actions which are self-aggrandizing actions, if we could put it that way. Self-building actions. Actions which continually preserve one's power, prestige, influence, amass one's wealth, so that the principle on which the nations operate is a principle by which they judge what is good and evil. The assessment of good and evil is based on what's good for us. And whether it's good for another person is really neither here nor there, so long as what's good for us and what's good for another doesn't collide head on, and then you have war. And you'll have war in your kitchen sometimes, if you have a toddler who understands what he thinks is good, or if you have a husband who understands what he thinks is good. And if that clashes, I can see a few smiles, but I won't look at anyone. So we judge what is good and evil for ourselves, of ourselves, by ourselves, and we act accordingly. And that judgment of good and evil is expressed in the principle of city building. Now, I'm going to be talking for a little while at various points today about the city, but I don't want us to think about a physical particular city necessarily. At various points in the Bible, there were cities, physical entities, which are mentioned and understood to be powers, like Babylon, like Rome, like Nineveh, and even wrongly like Jerusalem, who became like Babylon and like Sodom and Gomorrah. But when we talk about the city, we're talking about something which is greater than any physical place. We're talking about the city with a capital C, and it's very significant and interesting, I think, in the UK at least, that among the regular items on the news is the view of the city with a capital C. So here's some world event which has taken place, and we get a reaction from the city. Now, the city is that whole agglomeration of things which preserves human wealth, prestige, power, gives it a basis for operation. And so when a negative event, as we might interpret it, happens according to our knowledge of good and evil, then the city responds. And the stock market crashes, or the gold price goes through the roof, or oil hits $100 a barrel, or whatever it is. That whole complicated series of reactions and interactions, shifting ground to preserve one's wealth and guard one's treasure, that whole system is called the city with a capital C. And at various points it's manifest in a physical place, like Rome, like Babylon, like some other physical empire-building city, but that's not the city of which the Bible speaks. There's a principle behind the thrones. So the serpent comes to our primal parents and he leads them into this self-assessing knowledge of what's good and evil. And out of that self-assessing knowledge of good and evil, all human sinful activity flows. We will murder one another. We will destroy one another. We will commit horrendous acts of sin against and with one another, all on the basis of what's good and what's evil. Last time we commented on this man Nimrod. I just want to pay a little bit of attention to Nimrod this morning. You can read about him in chapter 10 of Genesis, verse 9. And you'll see that there is an emphasis given to the nature of Nimrod. Verse 8, Cush became the father of Nimrod. He became a mighty one. Verse 9, he was like a mighty hunter before the Lord. Therefore it said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord. There is, in fact, a submarine spotting plane called a Nimrod, which flies with the RAF. It's a hunter to hunt submarines. Well, Nimrod was not a hunter of that sort. He was a hunter of men. He drove people, as we said last week, drove people into his kingdom. But there's an emphasis that comes through here about the character of Nimrod. If you look at verse 8 and 9, you find that there is a word that's repeated 3 times within those 2 verses. And whenever that happens, particularly in the Old Testament, it's a way in which the writers are emphasizing something of great note. Here is mighty, mighty, mighty Nimrod. 3 times in 2 verses, mighty is used. Mighty, mighty, mighty Nimrod. And the word mighty itself is even given a special emphasis. We don't need to go into all of it today, but there's a way in Hebrew of giving an emphasis to a word. We say perhaps mighty, mightier, mightiest. Well, if you reduplicate, if you increase a letter once in the middle of a word, it's like intensifying a word. And mighty here is an intensified word. Sometimes you get it in military contexts where it might speak about David's mighty men who were valiant in battle. More often you get it in reference to God himself as the mighty one. But here it's mighty, mighty, mighty Nimrod. And you think, well, so he was a great man. No, he wasn't. Because his name is significant. We said last week that the name of Shem was significant because it means name. We shall make for ourselves a name. Nimrod means rebellion. Or let us rebel. So here's Nimrod. Mighty, mighty, mighty rebel. That's what it means. And Nimrod, the mighty rebel before the Lord, hunts men. And the beginning of his kingdom, the first centre, not the last centre, just the beginning of his kingdom was Babel, where they built the tower, later to be called Babylon. When the tower was destroyed and the nations were scattered, as we saw last week, then Nimrod went out and he built other cities, including Nineveh. So Nimrod was a mighty man in terms of his ability to accomplish the things which he perceived to be good. It was good that they build a city. It was good that its tower reach up to heaven. It was good that it be built with bricks that would not be washed away and use tar for mortar. And it was good that Nimrod be able to drive men into that kingdom, to hunt them. Now, throughout the Bible, you get indications, do you not, of the great seed who was to come. Remember in Genesis chapter 3, verse 15, there was the promise made that one would come from the seed of woman who would crush the serpent's head. And at various points, we do not find simply that there are prophecies about his coming, but also that there are people who, in a sense, are forerunners of him, which we pick up in the New Testament, like this strange figure Melchizedek. And then you get other people in the Old Testament who are sort of like prefigurements of Christ. People often look at Joseph and say, well, Joseph was a sort of Old Testament type of Christ. Well, just like you've got the seed who's going to come from woman, there is a seed who is going to come from the serpent. Someone he begets in his image. Someone on whose shoulders the city rides. And Nimrod is a sort of forerunner of all the antichrists in the world. Nimrod is a sort of Old Testament example of the seed of human wisdom, operating on the basis of what's good and what's evil for himself. It doesn't come through in our English translations. It couldn't really. But if you run your eye in Hebrew, not that my Hebrew is any good, but the commentators are pretty good on looking at it. If you run your eye down the account of the building of the Tower of Babel, there's a repetition of 3 Hebrew letters in different ways at different places. NBL. And from that you get the word Nabal, which means foolish or fool or folly. So in this great construction of human wisdom and ingenuity in which Nimrod and the other city builders saying we're accomplishing something great, the Old Testament just gives a little commentary sort of embedded in the text that says folly, 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 foolishness, foolishness, foolishness. And the Lord says, let us come down and scatter them. But Nimrod is the prime mover, it seems. The beginning of his kingdom was Babel. And Nimrod operates, therefore, as a sort of anti-type of Christ. Every element of Nimrod's throne is opposed to God and his kingdom. He establishes his kingdom directly as a point of rebellion against God. He's not an innocent city builder who's happening to go about his task and God gets crossed with him for no good reason. He's a mighty, mighty, mighty rebel, and he builds his city and his empire and his kingdom on the basis of his own knowledge of good and evil, riding on the shoulders of the serpent at that point, in order to unseat God from his throne, to topple him, to overthrow him, to take his stand against the Lord and against his anointed. He drives men and women into that purpose. And so every aspect of the kingdom of Nimrod and every Nimrod who's ever lived since that Nimrod is built on the same principle. Violence, bloodshed. It's built on the fact that by sheer military might, by political power, by economic persuasion, or by some other means, a man can get other people to do his will. He can enlist them in his service of what's good and evil. And he can convince them that what is good is really good. So whether it be Nimrod, or whether it be Nebuchadnezzar, or whether it be Hitler, or whether it be Nero, The principle of operation is exactly the same. And I just want us to think for a minute about the contrast. He builds a city in blood. Christ builds a city, and it's in blood. But it's not the blood of those whom he would enslave. And Nimrod builds his city by rebellion, by standing up on his hind legs, as it were, and shaking his fist at God, and Christ builds his by the simple submission to God's law, by the love of his Father. And Nimrod builds his cities out of power and politics and all the things that human beings would say make for strength and wealth. And Christ builds his city out of weakness, and he builds it out of the humility of his submission to his Father's will, even to the point of death on a cross. Couldn't get two more contrasting things. And here we come to something that we're going to have to remind ourselves of on many occasions as we go through. The city of man looks enormously substantial. It looks as though it has all the cards stacked in its favour. It looks as though it has all the power at its fingertips, which can just expunge the work of God just in a second. And by contrast, you could look at the work of God and it would seem, and does seem, does it not, so insubstantial. It could all seemingly blow away in a breath. It seems not to have anything lasting about it, except we know by faith that Jesus Christ is its foundation and its cornerstone. And anything that's built in him and through him and therefore on him is not going to be washed away. Those who believe in him will not be disappointed. And so the city in which we find ourselves by grace has a maker and builder who is God, and has a foundation which is sure and certain and steadfast. But to the eyes of sight, everything about the city of man looks entirely, everything about the city of God looks entirely insubstantial. By contrast, everything about the city of man looks to be so strong, so enduring, so lasting. And that's why we took in part the reading from Revelation chapter 17. Because the city which Nimrod builds, the beginning of his kingdom, is Babel, is just the start of the principle of the city. In fact, it's not the start, because Nimrod's forefather Cain was the first city builder. Another rebel against his maker, murderer. But when we read in Revelation chapter 17 of the city with a capital C, John has to be taken up in the Spirit in the wilderness to see it. In other words, if you were to just operate with your own earthly sight, judging by your own earthly reason, according to our own principles of what's good and evil, you would look at the city with a capital C, and you would see that is so strong and so substantial, so powerful and so alluring that it could never, ever be defeated. Now, the mechanism of that defeat we're not going to go into just now, except to say, if you look at the end of that reading from chapter 17, from verse 15 and following in the book of Revelation, you'll find that God gives his enemies enough power for their own defeat. God gives his enemies enough power for their own defeat. Like the city rides on the shoulders of the beast who comes out in response to the voice of the dragon. So the dragon and the beast and the city seem all at one, and they seem to be all working with a common purpose to destroy the Lamb and in the city is found all of the blood of all of the righteous people who've ever lived, she is a deadly enemy of the people of God, beloved. Don't be deceived. You can't play with the city. Can't play politics. And in her, when in league with the beast, in league with the serpent, it seems so strong, so unified. But evil can't build a thing. Only love can build anything. Only love can build. And God's love, how can we put it? God's love sort of circumvents all our judgments. It goes straight through the middle of all of our assessments of what's good and evil. And it just loves. See, one of the problems that we have relationally, is, do we not, is that we judge one another's actions according to various standards of good and evil, and then we say, well, that person has acted in that way, therefore that's not good, or it's evil, therefore I will not love, and I'm justified in not loving. God's love just circumvents all of that. And while we were yet his enemies, he loves us. And while we were without strength, he gives himself for us. While we were yet haters of God, he comes to us by his grace, circumventing all of our judgments about good and evil, right and wrong, and goes straight through to the cross and prays, Father, forgive them. They know not what they do. So the city seems so substantial in all of her actions, but it's not love, so it can't build anything. It's not love, so nothing can last. It's pride. And pride takes account of a wrong suffered. And pride does not exercise patience, and pride does not give itself. And pride stands on its hind legs, and because in our pride we say our assessment of good and evil is different from another person's assessment of good and evil, so the beast and the city and the dragon end up tearing one another apart. God gives them enough power to destroy themselves. It's not love, so it can't last. And so here you see this great principle of the city in Revelation chapter 17. And she rides on the shoulders of the beast, and the beast is the one who comes in the image of the serpent. And the statement that I want us to focus on as we come towards our close is that she rules over the kings of the earth. The city rules over the kings of the earth. When we talk about God and the nations and build out that theme, in effect we're answering or asking and answering this question: who will rule over the nations of the earth? We know God does. They are his nations. But in the words of one of the old hymns we sometimes sing, this world's proud rebel king has captured the nations for his purpose. And according to Revelation 17, one of the main means by which he captures the nations for his purpose is to raise up the city in all her allurements and security and beauty and temptation and everything that would seem to promise both happiness on earth and prosperity and wealth. And as the kings of the earth hear and respond to the voice of the city, they're enmeshed with her. And in Revelation chapter 18, they can't get over the fact that when God's time for the judgment is come, in 1 hour she falls. Seems so strong, so lasting. They seem to have vested so much time and money and energy in the life of the city. But the city is built on corruption. It's built on something which is not love. It's built on destruction because it rides on the shoulders of the beast who serves the serpent. It says in Revelation chapter 18 that the bottom point of the city's trade is human souls. She feeds on the blood of men and women. And the kings of the earth and the merchants and those who've engaged in trade with the city can't believe that she could collapse so quickly. And sure, as the tower builders in Genesis chapter 11 couldn't believe that it could come to an end so quickly. So the kings of the earth are not freestanding agents. They are ruled over. They are ruled over by the city. They are ruled over by the beast, by the serpent, by the dragon. But God's purpose is not, finally, that they would be the ones who would rule over the nations of men. Remember the prophecy that was said of Judah in Genesis chapter 49? That one would come from Judah, and to him would be the gathering of the nations. Remember what we've heard from Psalm 2 this morning, which Grant read earlier. The ends of the earth are his possession. The nations are his inheritance. But how does he win them? How does he create this kingdom which shall have no end? Well, he has to enter the city with a capital C. He has to go into the city in which all of the blood of all of the prophets and all of the righteous men who've ever lived, he has to go into that city. But as he goes into the city, he doesn't come in full of anger and hostility and bitterness and hardness because the city's been so hard. He comes in weeping over Jerusalem, who at that point is the embodiment not of the city of God, but at that point is the embodiment of the city of man, because those who should have known and recognized the day of their visitation did not. He came unto his own, and his own received him not. And he comes to Jerusalem, the embodiment of the city at that point. And he weeps over his people, the ones who have murdered his prophets, the ones who've slain all of the righteous men from Abel onwards. He weeps over them. And he says, I'm coming to you now. And he goes into the very heart of the city, riding on a donkey, to proclaim to that city, peace, if only you would have it. Peace. But as he goes into that city, he goes to the very centre of what is going to break the city. He goes to the judgment of his cross. Because the power of the city cannot match the weakness of God. The wisdom of the city of man cannot match the folly of the weakness of the cross of Christ. And so he goes into that city to bear in his body on the tree all of the rebellion of the nations. He bears in his body at the heart of that city, if we could put it that way. He bears in his body all of the wickedness and iniquity, so that those who are captive by the city with a capital C might hear a voice, another voice crying in the streets. Not the voice of the harlot who sits on many waters, which are the nations, but the voice of the bride and the voice of the Lamb. Say, come, come, you who have no money, buy water without cost. Come, feed on me, who's the bread of heaven, without cost. But the only way the power of the city can be broken is through the judgment of that cross. You can't see the city in all of its might and think that there's another way of defeating it. Can't marshal the politics and power and wealth and prestige of the church, in inverted commas, and then set that up against the city and let's see who can outgun who. That's not going to work. Beloved, we have a city builder. The builder of our city is God, but he's seeing to it that that city is built on the foundation stone of his Son. And his Son has secured the future of his city through his own blood. And as we find him there, our merciful and faithful high priest ruling over it, not like Nimrod, with all his harshness and legal power, but a merciful and faithful high priest ruling over us, he actually gives us good news, and that good news liberates the nations as they hear it. That's a great gospel we've been given, is it not? And a great thing to know that the city in which we abide is substantial. But don't ever try to make it seem substantial in your own sight or in the sight of the world. Live by faith in the security of that blood which has been shed for it. Our time's gone. We're going to close. No, we're not. We're going to sing and then we're going to pray together. We're going to sing 117, My Heart and Voice I Raise, to sing Messiah's Praise.